Good morning. This is the first of these Tuesday mornings here at Halekou, and like all of our work in the infinite way, it wasn't planned this way. It evolved. Some of you know that in December and January, students were continually coming over from the mainland. We had something over 20 in those 2 months. For special study. Some would come for 1 week, and some for 2, and some for 3. And since I expect to be at home here at least until August, it is apparent that more will be coming each month. 3 more are here with us today from the mainland. Naturally, there are some students on this island who have been very serious students, very earnest students, for several years, and some all the way back to my first coming to the island. They too would like to participate in some measure of work. And so this idea of Tuesday morning evolved so that the students from the mainland can be with us and meet the students of the islands, and vice versa, and so that an opportunity can be created for the students in the islands who wish to take advantage of the fact that I am here for some time. Now, the nature of the work depends on you, not on me. How it evolves will depend 100% on you. If you will notice in our tape work, the nature of the work changes with the nature of the student groups. In other words, each group or each city at a particular time brings out their need or the fulfillment of their need. You will notice, for instance, that on the last trip to Australia, that in Adelaide, a class evolved completely turning on the nature of healing work. Healing from the standpoint of the letter of truth, or healing by argument, and healing through the spirit. When we got back to the mainland, you find that our opening class in Chicago had nothing whatsoever to do with this subject. It was pure mysticism, that entire first class. It was as completely different from anything that had ever gone before as anything imaginable. Yet when we got to New York, the nature of the work changed so completely that listening to those tapes you would hardly imagine that this was a mystical message. It was right down to bedrock on healing and on treatment and on living. So it was that we arrived in London, and our first class was an open class, and you will find that it covered every subject that students of this work should know. When we got to Manchester, we were back into the healing work again. Now here was a section of the world up in northern England where they had never before had a closed class, and therefore their interest was in how to heal and how to be healed, and what are the specific principles that constitute the message of the infinite way. We got back to London, and here we're off on an entirely new note, and the advanced class and the London open work is again far beyond anything that ordinarily is given in classwork. So it is, and so it will be with this work. If anything worthwhile develops from this work, it will be because you have brought it forth. I sit here only as a transfer agent. You are bringing your consciousness to this room for light, revelation, fulfillment, and I come as an instrument through which that which we call God can meet your need. Always remember that. I cannot meet your need as a person. I cannot even know what your need is as a person. But I can, through my meditations, be a transparency through which your need may be met by the only one that can meet it, and that is God. When you understand that God is the reality of your own being, that God is closer to you than breathing and nearer than hands and feet, you will know that the only help that you can get from this work is from your own consciousness. And it is only because you have not yet learned to tune into that consciousness yourself and be taught of God that temporarily you need a teacher or mediator. For the day must come when that will no longer be necessary for anyone. Religious teachings, religious pioneers, leaders, saviors, these are only necessary in human experience until men and women get back to the Garden of Eden, where they have their own individual contact with their source and can draw on it. It is only the centuries of human living in a sense of separateness from God that makes it necessary to have religious books, metaphysical books, and teachers and teachings. Eventually these will all be done away with, because God is no respecter of persons. Every individual has the right to be God-inspired, God-taught, God-supplied, God-healed, or God-sustained and God-maintained. Let us see why this is not true at the present time. I mean that at the present time the world cannot turn itself to the kingdom of God within and find the answers. You understand this in proportion as you understand the meaning of the word God. Now, it is that three-letter word God that is at the moment separating you from your good. The reason is that the moment you think the word God, you think something erroneous, far from the truth. In the many centuries that have passed since this first sense of separation from God took place, the human race has sought something greater than itself with which to meet its needs. Back in the ancient days, what are now called paganistic days, they sought for a god, and they found gods many. Now, actually, they hadn't discovered God at all. They formed concepts of God. They entertained in their minds ideas or thoughts about God, mostly in accord with what they would like God to be. And out of that came these paganistic gods, one of which controlled beauty, and one the weather, and one fertility, and one prosperity, and so forth and so on. And these people looked to those gods to supply their human needs, whether it was for larger crops or larger herds or fish catches, whether it was for more rain or less rain, happiness, peace. They turned to these gods and expected that these gods would supply them with that which they lacked. Of course, it didn't happen, and so began the system of sacrifices, culminating even in animal sacrifices and human sacrifices, in order to get this god to do, or these gods, to do what they weren't doing because of supplication and pleading and petitioning. So they went a step further and began sacrificing. Ultimately, this evolved into forms of asceticism, in which people fasted, in which they gave up, in which they gave away their possessions, anything and everything in the world to placate this god or these gods who weren't performing according to that which was expected of them, hoped from them. Eventually, we come to the period of the Hebrews when we have one God. But if you will notice, the Hebrews looked to that one God for the self-same things that the pagans looked to the many gods for. And they approached God in the self-same way. They sacrificed. They tithed. They tried to be good humans. What evolved was a paganistic concept of God again, in which God had two sides. He was a punishing God and he was a rewarding God. If you did evil, God punished you. If you broke the laws, God punished you. And some of these laws were just about as stupid as you can imagine. Eating certain kinds of meat or certain kinds of fish was enough to make God punish you. Just like eating meat on Friday is apt to punish some people today. Now, because of these lack of answers, asceticism thrived in the Hebrew race, and fear of God became the dominant theme. Not love of God, but fear of God. You had to fear to do wrong because of what God would do to you. Now, the God of the Old Testament isn't any more God than the God of the pagans or the gods of the pagans. This also is a concept of God, a nationalistic or racial concept of God. The God who punishes, the God who rewards, so forth and so on. Unfortunately, Moses, who had attained God realization, found it impossible to convey that idea to his followers. Therefore, the entire demonstration of the Hebrew people in his day evolved from his consciousness. They benefited by his consciousness, and probably Aaron, Joshua, a few who surrounded him, who also had attained light. In the same way as the days of Isaiah, Elijah, whatever benefit came to the Hebrew race came because of the state of consciousness of those leaders, because the people themselves never attained God realization and continued worshiping this Hebrew God. Now, when the Master came, Christ Jesus, even though he was a Hebrew rabbi, preaching and teaching in the Hebrew synagogues, and exclusively to Hebrew people, even outside the synagogue, nevertheless, you find that he did not accept the Hebrew God, nor the Hebrew way of life, nor the Hebrew law, but he had evolved into a new consciousness, a higher consciousness, and his teachings were absolutely contrary to the Hebrew teachings, and it is for this reason that you must understand that he was crucified, because he did not teach Hebrew teachings, although he was wearing the robe of a Hebrew rabbi and preaching in Hebrew synagogues. But he was not teaching a God of punishment or a God of reward. You will not find that in his teaching. He taught that as ye sow, so shall ye reap. But he did not say that God was giving you the good if you were good, or that God was punishing you if you were evil. As a matter of fact, he made it very clear that it was your good deeds that resulted in good and your evil deeds that resulted in evil. As ye sow, so shall ye reap, and the bread that you cast on the water will come back to you. That's quite a different thing than saying if you don't throw bread on the water, God will punish you with lack, and if you do, that God will reward you with abundance. Now, Jesus did not teach asceticism. He said very frankly that it isn't what goes into the mouth that defiles, but that which comes out of your consciousness. It's your own state of consciousness that is visiting iniquities unto you, not the sins of your fathers or your grandfathers or your great-grandfathers, but your own iniquities. And this not necessarily in the form of sin as it is usually known. You can imagine the shock the Hebrew people in the church must have received when he said that man was not made for the Sabbath. Sabbath was made for man. In other words, what you do on Saturday isn't being held against you by any God. You are supposed to live your life of good 7 days a week. And if that prevents your getting to temple, that's perfectly all right with God, as long as you are about your Father's business. But deserting your spiritual life for the sake of going to temple or church or observing holidays will get you nowhere. So you see that the whole of the infinite way really comes about when it is realized that the basis of all harmonious spiritual living is dependent upon your knowing God aright. Whom to know aright is life eternal. There's the whole secret of harmonious living. There's the whole secret of healthful, happy living. There's the whole secret of joyous living. To know Him aright. Not to accept what you have been taught, which is definitely erroneous by its fruitage. If what has been taught about God for the last 5,000 years is true, the world is lost. Because even after these thousands of years, here the world trembles at what its fate may be when May comes around. Now, you know, that couldn't be if the world knew God aright. For to know God aright is life eternal, and then that wouldn't be dependent on bombs, and it wouldn't be dependent on the goodwill or evil will of people, whether our own people or foreign people. It is our ignorance of God alone that is responsible for all of the errors of this world. Now, our demonstration has shown that as long as you accept the God, the Santa Claus God, who will come around on December 25th if you are good, but he'll pass you by if you haven't been good, as long as you are worshiping that type of God, you have no hope whatsoever. As long as you continue worshiping a God that can be prayed to, you are losing your demonstration and will continue to lose it. God cannot be influenced by what you want or what you desire. God is not going to give to you individually, to this nation collectively, or any other, the things that we think we want or ought to have. There is no God of that nature. There is no God that can withhold and then, because of prayer, give. That is what we would call a super parent. Now, parenthood, which is based on that very type of erroneous love, makes people punish their children and reward their children, give and take, withhold, give, yield. That's all human. That is not divine. Just as the word punishment has no right ever to come into a spiritual teaching insofar as our relationship with God is concerned, so eventually we will learn that the word punishment has no right to come into relationship with children. Discipline, yes. Training, yes. But not punishment. However, because of these erroneous religious teachings, children actually believe when they are being disciplined or trained that they're being punished. And they resent it and they resist it. And you have a hard time with them. If they understood that there is no such thing as a parent really punishing a child, that every act of the parent to the child is one of loving guidance, training, discipline, the child would respond. That is, if it began early enough in life to know that it need never fear a punishment from its parent, that it would receive training, it would receive discipline and correction, but that it must never be construed as punishment, for no parent could truthfully want to punish a child. The moment you catch that concept, you begin to understand more nearly your relationship with God. It does not lie in God consciousness to give anyone anything, or to withhold from anyone anything, or to punish anyone for anything. The nature of God is love. The nature of God is also intelligence, wisdom. Can you imagine telling God what you need? Can you imagine telling God that you need healing? Or can you imagine asking God for healing? If God is the infinite intelligence of this universe and divine love, and do you not see then that the first mistake that is made is going back to pagan days and asking something of God, expecting something of God, wanting something of God, believing that God has in its power the ability to grant what you want. That must be fantastic in the light of the nature of God as intelligence and love. Now, the very first principle that an infinite way student must learn is the nature of God. In some way or other, whether through their reading or hearing. No, I won't say that. That's not true. You can't learn it through your reading and your hearing. But through your reading of this message and hearing this message, you can be led to cogitate, ponder, meditate, until from within your own being you learn the nature of God. God reveals himself to you within you. You see, what is coming out to you in words, message, is the truth about the truth. But the truth itself reveals itself to you from within you. These statements of truth you hear are merely meant to be taken into your consciousness. They are seeds, if you will, seeds which are being planted in you. And then, depending on the nurturing that you give these seeds, the care, will be the spiritual crop that you will receive. If you go back to Moses, you will see that he really had God realization, full and complete. But that only a few of those who were with him were able to receive it, to understand it, to live it. And the others went back again to their slavery days. They went back to wars, famine, conquering, and then came some more leaders and lifted them out of it. And again you have the few, the masses again losing all that they had gained through these leaders. And so on from Abraham all the way to Jesus. The life of the Hebrews shows how high they ascended when they had wonderfully illumined spiritual leaders, and how low they sank until at the time of Jesus Christ they were almost in their lowest estate. We know now from these scrolls that have been found and translated in recent years that for 150 years before Jesus Christ, the Hebrews suffered under their own leaders worse than they suffered from their conquerors. They were more badly treated, unfairly treated, unjustly treated by their own religious leaders than they were by their conquerors. For 150 years before Jesus and for 60 years after Jesus, it was the evils of their religious hierarchy that kept them in terrible bondage. And here comes Jesus with this marvelous message. And could he take the Hebrews out of their bondage? And the answer is no. A few hundreds of them only were able to see the light sufficiently, to apprehend it, comprehend it, discern, so as to follow him and the disciples into the Jewish Christian era. Why? inertia. It's a very difficult thing to stop doing today what you've been doing for the last 20 years. It's a very difficult thing to come out from among them and be separate. It is a very difficult thing to break the habits of a lifetime and believe something new. I'm thinking just in this moment of the time when my mother told me there was no Santa Claus and there was no use of hanging up stockings. But I must tell you the truth that I hung them up that year anyhow in case she was wrong. I was very reluctant to give up my Santa Claus. He was pretty good to me. And we are reluctant to give up the religious beliefs with which we have been indoctrinated. We are reluctant to give up the nationalistic beliefs, the racial beliefs. We are reluctant because in them we find a certain amount of security and respectability. Everybody else believes this way, and we aren't quite respectable if we don't. We aren't orthodox. We aren't regular. We aren't normal. We may even be insane. And even when it comes to our innermost being, our innermost thoughts, we are still reluctant. We find there an inertia that makes it difficult for us to accept that as ye sow, so shall ye reap. We find it difficult to believe that we have to make the change within ourselves in order to bring God's grace into our lives. We believe that we can be the same human being today that we were yesterday and yet have more of God's grace. That's impossible. We receive God's grace in proportion as we yield our humanhood. There is no way, the Master taught, to add new wine to old bottles. Do you see how we have passed up those passages? Why? Because it's so nice to ignore it and to believe that we can go on being the same person we were yesterday, with the same hates, fears, jealousies, animosities, and yet add to us more of God's grace. Either the coming of God's grace to our consciousness wipes out those tendencies, or we start some wiping out of the tendencies in order to create a vacuum for God's grace. One or the other has to take place. Certain it is that when a person has an experience such as Moses had, that they are never the same after that. The very fact of the experience transforms them, and they no longer go through life with the same human tendencies. Whatever experience it was that Jesus Christ had that transformed him from whatever his idea of a Hebrew rabbi was to a spiritually illumined being, whatever it was, took from him all of his loyalties to Hebraic teachings, to the Hebrew law, took from him his dependency on their rites and rituals and sacrifices, and gave him a whole new consciousness. So it is. Whenever an individual has an experience of illumination, it dissolves the human traits. They are then reborn. But so many of us do not start out with spiritual experiences. We start out as human beings, with all of the failings of human beings, racial, religious, national, and personal. And we know there is something to be attained spiritually. We know there is such a thing as God's grace. Something within us tells us that. That is why we stay on the path, as difficult as it is, and sometimes as frustrating as it is. We stay on it because something within us says, this is truth and I have to attain it. That is the experience of most of us. We go through very, very hard, difficult years because there is a song in our heart. Something says to us, this is truth, or there is truth. And we can't prove it. Day by day our problems come up over and over again, the same problems or new ones, or we get rid of some and find others take their place. And we all come to that place of, well, what is the use? What is the use? And the answer comes back, as it did to the disciples, where shall we go? Thou hast the word of truth. As difficult as it is, we have to stick to it because there is no other place to go. We know we can't go back to sensuality, sensuousness. We know that we can't go back to depending on bullets and bombs for safety and security. We know we can't go back to believing that the only hope for mankind is in a pill or a powder. We know we've gotten beyond that state, even though we may have to have recourse to them here and there. We may not completely make our demonstration day by day, but we know that there's no ultimate hope in them, and we know that we must go forward. Now, while we're doing it, let us remember this. We ourselves must make room for the spiritual experience. The Master outlines many, many ways for us. One especially when he says that if you go to the altar to pray and there remember that any man has aught against thee, get up. In other words, praying, meditating, communing, while you are still acknowledging a presence and power apart from God, or while you are attributing evil to persons, conditions, or nations, is folly, and your prayer can't break through. Not that your prayer is for God to do something, but your prayer is really the effort at inner contact, at one-ment, spiritual realization. Now, it is for this reason that Moses gave the Hebrews 10 commandments. Now, you must understand that a people to whom it is necessary to say, thou shalt not steal, or thou shalt not envy, thou shalt not murder, must have been very low in the animal scale of life. Jesus found a higher preparation for his message when he did away with 9 of those commandments and substituted just 2 commandments. In those 2 commandments are embraced the 9 that he omitted, because when a person comes to a measure of spiritual light, they have lost the capacity to steal, lie, cheat, defraud, envy, etc. In the experience of the Master, you will find the Sermon on the Mount takes the place of 10 Commandments. And now you will find that, not that he gave permission to steal, lie, cheat. I'm sure you know that by omitting those 9 commandments, he wasn't giving anybody permission to indulge them. Oh no, he knew that if you could live according to the Sermon on the Mount, you would have no need for them. Because temptation in those forms would not enter your consciousness. In the enlightened consciousness, the temptations resolve themselves into deep personal sense. That's why I have warned our students repeatedly that after you get to a certain place in your spiritual progress, you will find 3 serious temptations facing you. You believe, of course, that by the time you have attained some measure of spiritual demonstration, that there are no temptations for you, but that's not true. All of the temptations of the world will resolve themselves down to 3. And you have your difficulties with 1, 2, or all 3 of these before you rise completely above the human scene. Those 3 temptations are to be found in our classwork. The first is prosperity. This is probably the most difficult form of temptation to overcome. It is the form of temptation that wrecks more people than all the other temptations in the world. Prosperity. Why? Because prosperity brings with it the temptation of personal aggrandizement, the belief that I am successful, or that I am wise, or that I am powerful, or I am great. Next, it brings with it the temptation to indulge the things of this world at the expense of our spiritual practices. In other words, with prosperity, we can very well get so occupied that we do not have time for sufficient time for our meditations and our spiritual work and our benevolent work and our sharing with others. Also, pride of possession comes with prosperity. Oh, there are so many different things that makes prosperity the number 1 temptation in the experience of the spiritual student, because prosperity is one of the first things that come to those who attain some measure of spiritual light. And that's why it first becomes a temptation to them until they know how to handle prosperity and make it subservient to them instead of masters of them. The second temptation is lack. Many people, as they come to the spiritual, to the place of illumination, lose all that they have. Sometimes they lose home, business, position, savings, family. Sometimes spiritual illumination deprives a person of everything on which they had had their hopes and faith. circles of friends, relatives, drop away. And then, of course, that makes of lack a temptation, because now one says, well, if that's the price of being good and spiritual, let's go back to the old way. It was much more pleasant and fruitful and profitable, comfortable. Also, it brings the temptation to use human ingenuity. In other words, the temptation, again, to use human means, evasions, falsifications. Oh, you know the story of false advertising, erroneous advertising, and again, the human element would come in and deprive one of the opportunity of demonstrating that thy grace is my sufficiency in all things, and I will sit here and wait to prove it and demonstrate it if I have to starve, if I have to go to the last mile. I knew a practitioner in Detroit. In handling that very situation for a student, said, what are you afraid of? That you're going to miss a few meals? Well, yes, money's running short. Oh, well, the Hebrews have a fast day every year and they miss 3 meals and nothing terrible happens to them. That's right. But what about the second day or the third day? Oh, well, people go on fasts for a week or 2 weeks and nothing terrible happens to them. It has been known that people have fasted for 30 days. Nothing has happened to them. Oh, well, that puts a little different light on it. Then why not stand fast, even if you have to fast 30 days? It isn't likely that anyone who stands fast for that reason will find themselves without a God. That's a drastic attitude to take, but a reasonable one for a person on the spiritual path. The third temptation, of course, is that which is second only to death. We are told that death is the last enemy that shall be overcome, and next to death there is sex. That'll be the next to the last temptation that is overcome. And on the spiritual path, that plays a part because the relationship of people who are on the spiritual path is one that embodies and embraces so much love that if one isn't careful, there's a step across the boundary. And that makes the third temptation that has to be watched for on this spiritual path. Now, I don't know why we're off on that subject. That's far from where we started and far from where I meant to be. All I meant to bring out is that we must, until illumination comes, we must make efforts ourselves to live in accord with the Sermon on the Mount and to demonstrate the principles that we learn there, difficult as they may seem. Now, I want to give you today 2 principles which will help you, first of all, to bring about the spiritual illumination for yourself. While you're doing it, will help you in your healing work. These 2 principles really brought about the whole foundation of the message of the infinite way. The first is impersonalize good. And the second is impersonalize evil. Now, to impersonalize good means to see that good, any form, any way that it takes, any shape, good is an emanation of God. So that my expectancy is from God, not from man whose breath is in his nostril. Good may flow through me to you and through you to me, but it is not from me to you, and it is not from you to me. Be assured that in a true sense I do not love you, and be assured that you do not love me, and please be assured that I know you don't. Whatever it is that is flowing in your direction through me is your God drawing it unto you, and I am but an instrument that is used for that purpose. And I'm not important, because no matter what happened to me, as long as you are not looking to me, the next instrument will appear in your experience as long as you need an instrument. Whether it's a man, a woman, or a book, or a teaching, or a teacher, it will appear. Or a business or an employer. Never hesitate to see good leave your experience. It's only making room for a greater good. As long, yes, remember, you determine it. You determine it. As long as your expectancy is of God. Thy grace is my sufficiency in all things, and then you must be sure that you're not thinking of man or woman. You must leave yourself in that spiritual state where you realize thy grace is my sufficiency in all things. Because if you were ever called upon to be in Rickenbacker's position there, or Moses in the desert there, or somebody in an airplane here, you'd be in a terrible, terrible spot if you were looking to man whose breath is in his nostrils to be there as a help, because they may not be. And there may be no human help. But God can set a table in the wilderness if you bring it about. You must bring it about by your continuous faith. Thy grace is my sufficiency in all things. Do you see that? Of course, in our human intercourse, we love each other, and we are loving to each other, and grateful, and outpouring, and sharing, but not by virtue of ourselves. Don't lessen your benevolence. Don't lessen your sense of gratitude. Don't lessen your cooperativeness and your sharing. Rather, increase them, because you know the source is God, and you can afford anything. Nothing is beyond your means, if only you're realizing that the source is God. The source isn't your investment. The source isn't the size of your salary. The source isn't your husband's income. The source is God. That's impersonalizing good. And therefore, when good comes to you through others, of course you're as thankful and grateful to them as you would be to Jesus Christ or to Moses or Elijah. But that doesn't stop you from realizing, yes, but it was thy grace that is my sufficiency. All right, the next is impersonalizing evil, and that, of course, is likewise difficult, because you must break down the belief that you're suffering because you violated a law. You must break down the belief that there's a mental cause or a physical cause or a spiritual cause. There's only one cause for our difficulties. To know God aright is life eternal. We haven't known God aright. We haven't experienced God. It's in experiencing God that we find our freedom. Where the Spirit of the Lord is, there is liberty. I think that leads me to something for next Tuesday, and that will be the word consciousness. Because once you understand God as consciousness and understand that consciousness is your true identity, you will then know why there can be geniuses. Perhaps you saw the boy the other night on television in a wheelchair playing violin. Such a rendition on the violin is only seldom heard, as a 10-year-old boy in a wheelchair with polio. This Juilliard School in New York is keeping him in the United States for instruction. How does a 10-year-old boy, and one especially in a wheelchair, come forth with such brilliance? Then the next 10-year-old boy is a, juvenile delinquent. You'll understand that when you understand consciousness. And you'll understand why each one of us must evolve from where we are in consciousness now to where we hope to be, and why we are only here now because we've already evolved to the degree that the person outside who doesn't even know we're here this morning can't be here, because their consciousness hasn't evolved to the extent that would make it possible for them to understand what we're talking about. Do you see that?